A farmer watched his fields dry up year after year. Everyone said it was the climate. Bad luck, nothing more. But when he decided to drill a new well, he discovered something underground that was never meant to be there. One finding changed everything and revealed that his land wasn't drying out by accident. Watch until the end. The truth goes deeper than you think. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Morning came to the farm without mercy. There was no dew clinging to the blades of grass, no faint shimmer on the soil that once promised life. The ground lay bare and cracked, its surface split into pale seams that ran outward like veins drained of blood. The wind moved across the fields in thin, dry breaths, lifting dust instead of scent, carrying nothing but the faint taste of heat and exhaustion. The farmer stood at the edge of his land and looked out over it the way a man looks at someone he has loved for decades and no longer recognizes. This land had raised him as much as he had raised it. He had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his own, and for most of his life the soil had responded to work with quiet loyalty. It had never been easy, never generous without effort, but it had always been fair. You planted, you waited, you endured the seasons, and in return the land gave back enough to justify hope. That balance had held for years, long enough to feel permanent. Then slowly at first, and then with unsettling speed, it began to break. The change had not arrived like a disaster. There had been no single storm that failed to come, no dramatic drought that could be named and dated. Instead, it had crept in through small losses. One season, the yield dropped by a fraction he could explain away. Another year, the soil dried faster after rain, the moisture sinking out of reach as if pulled downward by an invisible hand. The following season, the same crops that grew on neighboring farms struggled here, stunted and pale, their roots finding emptiness where they once found sustenance. Each year he adjusted, adapted, told himself this was what farming had always been. But the numbers in his old notebooks told a story his pride resisted. He kept those notebooks in a metal drawer in the house, their pages yellowed and soft from years of use. They were records of planting dates, rainfall estimates, fertilizer ratios, harvest weights. He had begun flipping through them late at night, tracing columns with his finger, comparing years that felt similar in memory but proved wildly different on paper. The decline was steady, almost elegant in its consistency. No sudden collapse, no chaotic swings, just a smooth downward slope. It unsettled him more than a disaster would have. Disasters ended. This felt designed to continue. He tried everything that made sense. He rotated crops, switched varieties, adjusted planting depth, changed irrigation schedules. He invested in soil treatments he could barely afford, listened to advice from agronomists who spoke in probabilities and averages that did not fit what he saw with his own eyes. He repaired old irrigation lines, replaced cracked hoses, sealed leaks that had gone unnoticed for years. None of it held. The water came briefly and then vanished. After a rain, the fields looked promising for a day, sometimes less. Then the surface hardened again. The moisture pulled away as if drained through a hidden sieve. Neighbors shrugged and spoke about climate shifts, about bad decades and worse ones to come. Yet when he walked their land, he saw something different. Their fields suffered too, but not like his. Where his soil turned brittle and gray, theirs retained a darker hue. Where his crops wilted by midday, theirs endured until evening. The difference was subtle enough to be ignored by anyone not looking closely. But he looked closely because his survival depended on it. He began marking the dead patches of his fields, sketching them roughly on old maps spread across his kitchen table. Over time, the pattern emerged. The worst areas aligned, forming a rough line that cut through his land with quiet precision. Debt followed the decline as predictably as night followed day. Equipment payments, seed costs, fuel, maintenance all remained constant while income shrank. He delayed repairs, sold older machinery, negotiated extensions that bought time but no relief. The idea of selling part of the land surfaced more than once, dismissed each time with the same stubborn resolve. To sell would be to admit defeat, not just to the market or the weather, but to something deeper he could not yet name. The farm was not merely property. It was proof that the life he had chosen still made sense. At night, when the house settled into silence, He lay awake listening to the distant creak of cooling metal and the whisper of wind against dry grass. His thoughts circled the same question until it wore thin. Why here? Why this land, which had known both drought and abundance and survived both, now seemed unable to hold water at all? He remembered the stories his father told, of hard years and lean harvests, of storms that flattened crops and winters that froze them. None of those stories matched what he was living through. This was quieter, more persistent, as if the land itself were being bled slowly, carefully, by a hand that knew exactly how much to take without drawing attention. The idea that the cause might lie beneath the surface came to him gradually, first as a passing thought, then as a growing certainty. Farming taught a man to look down, to understand that what mattered most happened where the eye could not see. Roots, moisture, microorganisms, the slow exchange between soil and water. When he pressed his boot into the earth after a rain and felt how little resistance there was, how quickly the impression dried and crumbled, something hardened in him. Water was not evaporating, it was leaving. He checked the old well near the eastern boundary of the property, one that had been dug long before modern equipment made deeper drilling common. The water level had dropped more than expected, far more than rainfall patterns could justify. He measured again, then again weeks later, confirming the decline. It was steady like everything else. Not a sudden loss, but a controlled one. He walked the perimeter of his land, noting subtle depressions, places where the ground felt cooler beneath his feet, where the grass clung to life just a little longer. Each observation tightened the same conclusion. The decision to drill a new well was not made lightly. It required money he did not have, and risk he could not afford. But it was also the last logical step before surrender. He studied permits, reviewed regulations, made calls that drained what little optimism remained in him. The paperwork moved slowly, as paperwork always did, but nothing outright stopped him. That absence of resistance felt strange in its own way, though he could not yet explain why. He prepared the site near one of the worst dead zones, reasoning that if water existed anywhere below, this would be the place to find it. On the day the drilling equipment arrived, he watched the machine settle into position with a mixture of hope and dread. The metal tower loomed over the field, out of place among the low crops and open sky. As the drill bit sank into the earth, layers of soil and clay emerged, dark at first, then pale and dry. He waited, counting depth in his head, imagining the moment when water would surge upward, validating the risk he had taken. Instead, the machine shuddered and stopped with a sound that did not belong to stone. The vibration traveled up through the ground and into his legs. The operator cut the engine, confusion written across his movements. The bit had struck something solid, something unyielding, far too smooth and resistant to be natural. They cleared the debris and tried again, adjusting angle and pressure. The result was the same. Metal rang against metal, deep and unmistakable. The farmer felt a tightening in his chest, not from disappointment, but from a sudden electric sense of discovery. They began to dig by widening the hole, peeling back layers of earth until the obstruction revealed itself. A curved surface emerged, coated in dirt, but unmistakably manufactured. As more soil fell away, its scale became clear. This was no pipe for irrigation or drainage, no relic of a forgotten fence line. It was massive, wide enough for a man to crawl through, laid with precision and intent. The earth around it was compacted, reinforced, shaped by hands and machines that had worked carefully to hide it. He ran his hand along the exposed metal, feeling the cold beneath the dust. The surface bore marks of age but not decay. Whoever had placed it here had built it to last. The realization settled slowly, heavy and undeniable. Something had been buried beneath his land without his knowledge, without any record he had ever seen. And whatever it was, it had been there long enough to reshape the fate of his fields. As the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the excavation, he stood alone beside the opening in the earth, the silent curve of metal reflecting the last light of day. The dry wind moved over the fields, unchanged, indifferent. For the first time in years, the farmer did not feel helpless. He felt watched by something older than his struggle, something that had been waiting patiently beneath the soil. The land had stopped giving, but now it was beginning to answer. The night after the discovery passed without sleep. The image of the buried metal curve stayed with him, hovering behind closed eyes, refusing to soften into uncertainty. By morning, the wind had scoured the excavation dry, leaving the exposed surface of the object clean and stark against the pale soil. He returned to the field before the sun climbed high, driven by a need to confirm that what he had seen was real and not a distortion born of exhaustion and desperation. The machine still stood where it had been shut down, silent and patient, its tracks pressed into the ground like scars. He began again where the digging had stopped, widening the pit carefully, working the earth away in measured layers. With each shovel of soil, the shape resolved further, revealing a continuous arc that did not end where logic suggested it should. This was not a short segment or a junction. It was a line, running straight and unbroken, set with the confidence of a structure meant to endure decades without question. The dirt packed around it was denser than the surrounding soil, as if deliberately compacted to protect and conceal what lay beneath. He paused more than once, listening for sounds he could not name, half expecting the ground itself to protest his intrusion. As the opening grew, the size of the structure asserted itself. The diameter was greater than any agricultural conduit he had ever encountered, large enough that a man could crouch and move within it. The metal bore no identifying marks he could see, no logos or obvious stamps, only the faint impressions of manufacturing seams smoothed over with care. Its surface was cool to the touch, even under the rising heat, holding the night within it. He brushed away the remaining dirt, exposing a length long enough to make denial impossible. This was not an accident, not a remnant of some forgotten farm project. It was infrastructure. He followed the line of the pipe, marking its path across the field with stakes driven into the soil. The alignment mirrored the pattern he had traced months earlier when mapping the dead zones of his crops. The coincidence struck him with a force that left him standing still, the weight of the realization settling slowly into place. The pipe did not merely cross his land, it defined it. Where it passed, the soil above had weakened, dried, surrendered. He knelt and pressed his palm to the ground directly over the metal, feeling a subtle difference, a faint coolness that contradicted the heat shimmering above the field. Curiosity gave way to method. He fetched tools, measuring tape, instruments borrowed and improvised, applying the same disciplined observation that had guided him through years of planting and harvest. He checked the soil moisture at regular intervals along the pipe's route, confirming what instinct had already told him. The ground directly above was consistently drier than the surrounding areas, as if water were being drawn away with purpose. He noted the slope of the land, the way gravity would favor a flow along this buried line. The pieces assembled themselves without haste, forming a picture that left little room for doubt. The question of whether the pipe was active haunted him. An abandoned structure might explain the past, but not the present. He watched for signs that would betray movement, condensation, temperature variation, vibration too subtle to be felt without attention. Late in the afternoon, when the heat peaked and the field lay still, he lowered a thin strip of fabric into a narrow opening he had uncovered along the seam. The fabric stirred, barely perceptible, moved by a current that should not have existed. The breath of air that escaped carried with it a dampness that contradicted the dryness above. The pipe was alive. He straightened, scanning the horizon as if expecting to see witnesses emerge from the fields. The sense of isolation pressed in on him, heavier now than before. Whatever this structure was, it had been designed to remain unseen, its presence denied by the very earth that concealed it. He understood then that uncovering it was not simply an act of discovery, but a transgression, a step beyond boundaries drawn long before he arrived on this land. The realization did not frighten him so much as it clarified the stakes. The drought that had crippled his farm was no longer an abstract misfortune. It had a physical form, a direction, a destination. He followed the pipe beyond the limits of the excavation, walking its projected path across the property. It disappeared beneath a stand of scrub near the western boundary, the vegetation there thinner, weaker than it should have been even by recent standards. On the opposite side, the line extended toward a low rise beyond his fence, land he did not own, land that sloped gently downward toward distant structures he could just make out on the horizon. Warehouses, storage yards, places that looked greener than they should have, even in a season like this. The contrast unsettled him. Water did not vanish, it moved. The urge to seek answers drove him into town that same evening. He began with the most straightforward route, presenting the discovery as a matter of safety and record-keeping. He spoke with officials who listened politely and offered nothing in return. They consulted databases, flipped through digital maps, shook their heads with rehearsed concern. According to every record they accessed, nothing of significance ran beneath his land. The pipe did not exist. He pressed for explanations, pointed to the physical evidence waiting in his field. The responses grew vague, cautious, evasive. He was advised not to interfere further until proper assessments could be made, though no timeline was offered for when those assessments might occur. The absence of curiosity disturbed him more than open hostility would have. He expected questions, inspections, interest. Instead, he encountered a wall of indifference that felt constructed rather than natural. When he asked about historical projects, about industrial developments from decades past, the conversation shifted. Files were unavailable, records incomplete, personnel changed. Each interaction ended the same way, with him thanked for his concern and gently dismissed. The message, unspoken but clear, was that some questions were not meant to be pursued. Back on the farm, the pipe waited, silent and unchanged. He returned to it under cover of darkness, driven by a need to understand it on his own terms. He cleared more soil, exposing a joint reinforced with bolts that had been tightened and sealed with care. This was no makeshift installation. It was the product of planning, funding, and authority. He traced the bolts with his fingers, imagining the hands that had turned them, the decisions that had placed this structure beneath his future without his consent. A memory surfaced then, unbidden, of a conversation he had overheard years earlier at a supply store. An older man had mentioned strange construction beyond the ridge, work done quietly, guarded closely, then abandoned just as quietly. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it took on shape and substance. He began asking questions in places where records were not kept, listening more than he spoke. Fragments emerged. A large industrial facility built quickly and closed just as fast. A project that had promised jobs and prosperity, but delivered little more than rumors and silence. Water had been central to it, drawn from sources that were never fully disclosed. The more he learned, the more the pipe beneath his field seemed less like an anomaly and more like a remnant of a system that had simply adapted rather than disappeared. The facility might have closed, but the infrastructure remained, repurposed or quietly maintained to serve interests that preferred anonymity. The thought that his land had become an unwitting component in that system filled him with a slow, controlled anger. He had paid the price for years, losing crops, time, and dignity, while the benefits flowed elsewhere. He attempted a small test, careful not to cause damage that could be used against him. He adjusted the soil around a minor access point, altering the pressure just enough to observe a response. Within hours, he noticed subtle changes above ground, moisture lingering where it had not before. The effect was limited, temporary, but undeniable. The system responded because it was active, sensitive, monitored. The knowledge carried with it an immediate consequence. The following day, a notice arrived informing him of an upcoming inspection related to water usage compliance, scheduled with unusual haste. The timing left no room for coincidence. Someone had noticed his interference. The realization settled into him with the weight of confirmation. This was no forgotten relic. It was a functioning artery, and he had placed his hand upon it. As he stood at the edge of the excavation, the metal surface catching the last light of evening, he understood that uncovering the pipe had altered more than the future of his farm. It had drawn him into a struggle that extended far beyond his fields, into a network of decisions and interests that thrived on remaining unseen. The drought had brought him here, but the metal beneath the plow had ensured he could not turn back. The inspection notice did not surprise him, yet it marked a clear shift in the nature of his struggle. Until then, the drought had been something he fought alone, an adversary without a face. Now the opposition had form, procedure, signatures at the bottom of official pages. The timing was too precise to dismiss. He folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the notebooks he had kept for years. understanding that from this moment forward, every step he took would need to be deliberate. He began with the most obvious path: records. If a structure of that scale crossed his land, there had to be documentation somewhere. He returned to the county offices, this time prepared, bringing maps, photographs, measurements, dates. He presented his findings calmly, not as accusations but as facts that required clarification. The responses followed a familiar pattern. Clerks typed, paused, frowned at screens, then shook their heads. According to official cadastral maps, there were no registered utilities, no easements, no industrial corridors beneath his property. The pipe, as far as the system was concerned, did not exist. He requested older archives, those not yet digitized, records from decades past when oversight had been looser and projects less transparent. The request was met with polite reluctance. Files were missing, storage facilities had been consolidated, some materials had been destroyed according to retention policies no one could fully explain. Each answer closed a door while pretending it had never been open. He left with copies of empty reports and a growing sense that absence itself was the evidence. Refusing to accept official silence as truth, he turned to older maps, the kind printed on thick paper, their edges frayed from use. He found them in libraries, private collections, and the back rooms of institutions that rarely saw visitors anymore. Laying them side by side, he traced changes in land designation over time. Roads that appeared and vanished, zones once marked as restricted that later dissolved into blank space. In one faded plan from the early 70s, he noticed a narrow, unlabeled corridor cutting across what was now his farm. It had no legend, no explanation, but it aligned almost perfectly with the path of the buried pipe. The discovery did not bring relief. It brought confirmation. Whatever had been built here had been intentionally obscured, stripped of identifiers until it blended into the background of forgotten infrastructure. He searched newspapers from the same period, scanning microfilm reels until his eyes burned. Mentions of a major industrial development surfaced briefly, framed as a symbol of progress and economic promise. Then the coverage stopped. A year later, a short notice announced the facility's closure, citing restructuring and shifting priorities. There was no follow-up, no investigation, no accounting of what remained. He spoke with people who had lived in the area long enough to remember those years. Conversations took place in kitchens and workshops, over cups of coffee that went cold as memories surfaced. They recalled convoys of trucks moving at odd hours, construction crews that did not hire locally, security that discouraged curiosity. Water usage had spiked back then, wells drawn down faster than usual, but complaints were dismissed as temporary disruptions. When the facility shut down, life resumed its ordinary rhythm, but something subtle had changed. The land never fully recovered. As he pieced these accounts together, a pattern emerged. The pipe beneath his field was not an isolated artifact, but part of a larger system designed to move water discreetly from one place to another. It had been built under the authority of the state, shielded by national interest or economic urgency, then abandoned in name only. The infrastructure had remained, quietly reassigned to serve new purposes without ever re-entering public awareness. It existed in a blind spot created deliberately and maintained through inertia. The deeper he dug into the past, the more resistance he encountered in the present. Requests for information triggered delays. Appointments were canceled without explanation. People who had once spoken freely became guarded, offering less with each subsequent conversation. He noticed unfamiliar vehicles near his property more frequently, parked just long enough to observe, never long enough to confront. The inspections multiplied, each one justified on paper, collectively forming a net that tightened around his time and resources. The pressure was subtle but relentless. He was not threatened outright. Instead, he was reminded of regulations, of liabilities, of the consequences of interfering with infrastructure he could not legally prove existed. The contradiction was almost elegant in its cruelty. He could not challenge the pipe without acknowledging it, and he could not acknowledge it without violating rules that denied its presence. The system protected itself through paradox. Late one evening, as he reviewed his notes, he found a reference he had overlooked. It was a minor detail in an old internal report, a line item mentioning water diversion capacity associated with a decommissioned industrial zone. The report itself was incomplete, its appendices missing, but the implication was clear. Water had been redirected on a scale far greater than local needs, and the mechanism for that diversion had never been dismantled. The pipe beneath his land was not a mistake. It was an asset. The realization shifted his focus. He stopped trying to prove the pipe's existence through official channels and instead concentrated on demonstrating its activity. If he could show that water was still flowing, still being taken, the narrative would change. It would no longer be about history, but about ongoing harm. He began documenting everything meticulously: soil moisture readings, temperature differentials, subtle vibrations detectable at certain times of day. He mapped downstream effects, noting where vegetation thrived unnaturally in an otherwise parched landscape. With each piece of data, his understanding deepened. The pipe did not simply drain his land indiscriminately. It followed a controlled pattern, adjusting flow in response to demand elsewhere. This was not passive leakage. It was management. Someone, somewhere, was still relying on the system. The thought unsettled him more than any bureaucratic obstruction. It meant that his suffering was not a relic of past negligence, but a consequence of present decisions made without his knowledge or consent. As weeks passed, the sense of being watched intensified. His phone calls dropped unexpectedly. His emails went unanswered. The inspection that had seemed urgent was postponed indefinitely, leaving him in a state of unresolved vulnerability. He understood then that uncertainty was itself a tactic. As long as his status remained unclear, he would hesitate to act, waiting for permission that would never come. The chapter of discovery closed with a single, undeniable conclusion. The pipe beneath his land was real, active, and deliberately unrecorded. It was part of a system designed to operate in silence, protected by layers of denial and procedural fog. The drought that had nearly broken him was not an accident of nature, but the visible symptom of an invisible extraction. And now that he had seen it, truly seen it, the land no longer seemed merely exhausted. It seemed violated. Once the idea of accident had been stripped away, the land itself seemed to speak more clearly. What had once felt like vague misfortune now revealed patterns everywhere he looked. He returned to the field with a different gaze, no longer searching for signs of survival, but for evidence of extraction. The soil told its story readily to anyone willing to listen. Where the pipe ran beneath the surface, the ground cooled faster at dusk, held less moisture at dawn, and resisted every attempt to restore balance. It was as if the land above had been hollowed out, not physically but functionally, stripped of its purpose. He began to work methodically, applying the same discipline he once reserved for planting schedules and harvest forecasts. He marked precise points along the pipe's path, recording soil temperature and moisture content at regular intervals, comparing them to control areas just meters away. The differences were small but consistent, too consistent to ignore. Water was being drawn downward and carried away, leaving behind a thin illusion of normality that vanished under scrutiny. Rain fell, but it did not stay. Irrigation helped briefly, then failed, the moisture slipping away into the unseen corridor beneath his feet. As his understanding grew, so did his awareness of scale. The pipe did not serve his land alone. Its direction pointed toward lower elevations beyond his property, areas that defied the regional drought with stubborn greenery. He drove the perimeter roads, observing from a distance, noting industrial lots where grass remained improbably lush, retention ponds that never seemed to dry, facilities that consumed water without drawing attention. None of it proved anything on its own, but together it formed a chain of cause and effect that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The realization that his farm had become a sacrifice zone settled heavily on him. The system had been designed to take from somewhere discreet, somewhere unlikely to resist effectively. His land fit that description perfectly. Isolated, modest, owned by a man without political influence or legal resources. The water vanished quietly, season after season, while the beneficiaries remained out of sight. The injustice of it burned, but anger alone would not restore what had been taken. He needed proof that could not be brushed aside. His first attempt to intervene was cautious, almost tentative. He did not intend to damage the pipe or disrupt its operation in a way that could be construed as sabotage. Instead, he focused on observation through interaction. He cleared a small service area along a joint he had previously uncovered, careful to leave no obvious trace of tampering. By adjusting the surrounding soil pressure and exposing a narrow section of the seam, he hoped to provoke a response subtle enough to reveal activity without triggering alarms. The response came sooner than he expected. Within hours, he noticed changes in the field directly above the adjusted section. Moisture lingered longer than usual, the soil remaining dark and pliable well into the afternoon. The effect was limited, localized, but unmistakable. The system reacted to his interference, compensating elsewhere, drawing harder from adjacent sections to maintain overall flow. The pipe was not merely active, it was regulated. That night, the first consequence arrived. An email notification informed him of an upcoming compliance review related to water usage and land management, scheduled with unusual urgency. The language was polite, procedural, but the implication was clear. Someone had noticed the disturbance. The message did not accuse him of anything directly, but it reminded him of responsibilities and restrictions, of penalties associated with unauthorized interference in protected infrastructure. The irony was sharp enough to taste. He was being warned about violating a system that officially did not exist. The pressure escalated quickly. Inspectors arrived unannounced, their visits framed as routine but their questions pointed and persistent. They examined irrigation equipment, checked permits, measured runoff, and scrutinized records with an intensity that bordered on theatrical. Each inspection ended with notes and recommendations that translated into costs he could barely absorb. None of it addressed the pipe. None of it acknowledged the source of the problem. The burden of proof remained squarely on him, while the true cause remained protected by silence. Despite the risk, he continued his investigation. He followed the pipe's path beyond his land, tracing its influence through the landscape. In areas where the system delivered water rather than removed it, the contrast was stark. Vegetation thrived in defiance of the climate, infrastructure expanded without obvious supply constraints, and permits for water usage appeared effortlessly approved. The disparity revealed the underlying logic of the system. Water was not scarce, it was allocated. The knowledge altered his relationship with the land. What had once been a source of frustration now became a site of quiet defiance. Each measurement he recorded, each observation he logged, felt like a small act of reclamation. He began to compile his findings into a coherent narrative, linking soil data with historical records, aligning present conditions with past decisions. The story that emerged was not dramatic in the way disasters were, but it was devastating in its calm precision. A line had been drawn beneath his land, and everything above it had been deemed expendable. The scrutiny intensified as his efforts continued. Vehicles appeared more frequently along the access road, lingering just long enough to be noticed. Phone calls ended abruptly. Conversations with officials grew shorter and more guarded. The message was unmistakable now. He was being watched, assessed, weighed. The system did not need to threaten him openly. It relied on fatigue, on the slow erosion of resolve brought about by constant pressure and uncertainty. Yet the more they pushed, the clearer his path became. He understood that silence had been purchased for decades through a combination of ignorance and resignation. Previous landowners had likely sensed something was wrong, but lacked the means or the will to confront it. Some had accepted compensation without fully understanding its source. Others had simply left, their departures explained away as economic failure rather than quiet coercion. The pattern was complete now, visible from end to end. He stood one evening at the edge of the excavation, watching the last light fade from the exposed metal below. The pipe reflected the sky faintly, a dull mirror to the world above it. He realized then that the struggle was no longer about saving a single harvest or even a single farm. It was about exposing a mechanism that thrived on invisibility, that converted land and livelihoods into inputs without acknowledgement. The water that disappeared beneath his fields carried with it years of loss, but it also carried the truth of what had been done. As night settled in, he made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He would no longer limit himself to observation. He would document, preserve, and prepare. If the system depended on secrecy, then light was its only weakness. The pipe beneath his land had stolen quietly for too long. Now, whether the consequences favored him or not, it would no longer do so unnoticed. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It accumulated the way drought had, through repetition and persistence, wearing down resistance by sheer duration. After the decision he made beside the exposed pipe, the world around him seemed to tighten, as if the land itself had passed his resolve upward through invisible channels. Inspections that once came sporadically now followed a rhythm. Letters arrived with official seals and neutral language, each one demanding time, attention, and money. None accused him directly, yet all implied fault. Water usage audits, environmental compliance reviews, equipment certifications that had never been questioned before suddenly required revalidation. The burden was not in any single demand, but in the accumulation of them, in how they crowded out the work of actually keeping the farm alive. He learned quickly that exhaustion was the system's favored tool. Each inspection forced him to prepare documents, halt field work, accompany officials across land that no longer produced enough to justify the interruption. Fines were small enough to appear reasonable, but frequent enough to erode what little margin he had left. Repairs were mandated on equipment that had functioned safely for years. Deadlines overlapped. Appeals disappeared into administrative voids. It was all technically legal, meticulously justified, and devastatingly effective. At the same time, another current began to flow beneath the surface of this pressure. It came not in writing, but in suggestion, not in commands, but in implication. A man he vaguely recognized from a supply distributor stopped by one afternoon, making conversation that drifted too smoothly toward concern. He spoke about how difficult things had become for small operators, how many had lost everything by fighting battles they could not win. He mentioned programs, assistance, compensation arrangements designed to ease transitions. Nothing was said explicitly, yet the message carried weight. There were ways to make problems disappear. The offer took clearer shape days later, delivered through a channel carefully chosen to feel informal. It involved financial relief substantial enough to stabilize the farm, access to credit lines that had been closed to him for years, and assurances that inspections would return to their previous, manageable frequency. All he needed to do was stop digging, stop documenting, and allow matters beneath his land to remain beneath it. The pipe was not mentioned, but it did not need to be. Its presence hovered over the proposal like an unspoken clause. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he began looking backward, trying to understand how others had reached the point he now faced. Through quiet inquiries and fragmented stories, he uncovered the fates of those who had owned the land before him. They had not been incompetent or careless, as local narratives suggested. They had struggled in ways eerily similar to his own. Crops failed without explanation. Water vanished. Pressure mounted. Some accepted payouts framed as buyouts or development compensation, leaving quietly, their departures attributed to personal choice. Others resisted longer and paid for it with bankruptcy, their names reduced to cautionary footnotes. The realization hardened into certainty. This was not an anomaly. It was a cycle, repeated whenever a landowner became inconvenient. Silence had been purchased many times over, not with threats, but with attrition. The system did not need to destroy people openly. It merely needed to make resistance more painful than compliance. The conflict began to take its toll on him in ways he could not fully control. Sleep became erratic. The strain of constant vigilance left him sharp-edged, impatient, prone to long silences. He felt the weight of responsibility not just to the land, but to the idea of himself he had carried for decades. To accept the offer would preserve the farm in name, perhaps even restore some measure of stability. To refuse would risk everything, including the future he had spent his life trying to secure. The choice was not abstract. It pressed in on him from every direction, asking what kind of man he was willing to be when no option led cleanly forward. Each time doubt crept in, he returned to the fields. He walked the dry ground, felt the brittle soil crumble underfoot, and imagined the water moving unseen beneath him, redirected by decisions made without his consent. The anger that rose then was not loud or explosive. It was controlled, focused, sharpened by years of loss he had been told to accept as natural. He understood that taking the offer would not undo what had been done. It would only make him part of the mechanism that allowed it to continue. He began gathering his evidence with renewed urgency. Every observation was logged with time and location. He photographed the pipe at different stages of exposure, documented soil readings before and after rainfall, recorded the timing of inspections relative to his own activities near the buried system. He created duplicates of everything, storing copies off-site, ensuring that no single action could erase the record he was building. The work was painstaking and risky, but it gave structure to his resolve. He also recognized the limits of acting alone. Local channels were compromised by proximity and familiarity, too entangled with the very structures he sought to expose. Any attempt to raise concerns through them would be absorbed, neutralized, or turned against him. The path forward required distance, visibility, and scale. He began researching avenues that operated beyond the reach of local influence, entities that thrived on public scrutiny rather than avoided it. The idea of bringing the story into the open frightened him more than any inspection ever had, but it also offered the only plausible end to the cycle. The response from those offering silence grew less patient. The compensation was increased, framed now as a final opportunity rather than a suggestion. The language remained polite, but the implications darkened. Future inspections might not be so flexible. Outstanding issues could be revisited. Permits might be reconsidered. The system was not threatening him directly. It was reminding him of its capacity to make life unbearable without ever crossing into illegality. He stood at the edge of the excavation one last time before making his decision, the metal curve of the pipe catching the dull afternoon light. He thought of the years he had spent trying to coax life from soil that had been quietly drained of its chance to respond. He thought of the men before him who had faced the same choice and chosen differently, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. He did not judge them. He understood them too well. The final clarity came not as a surge of courage, but as a calm acceptance of consequence. He knew what agreeing would cost him, even if the farm survived. It would cost him the right to name the truth of his own experience. It would bind him to a lie large enough to reshape landscapes and small enough to pass unnoticed. He understood then that silence was not neutral. It was a transaction, one that transferred harm outward to someone else's land, someone else's life. When the moment came, his refusal was quiet and unadorned. He did not argue or explain. He simply continued his work, continued documenting, continued preparing. The offer stopped. The pressure did not. But something fundamental had shifted. The system now faced a variable it could not easily account for. A man who had decided that the cost of speaking was no longer higher than the cost of remaining silent. The days that followed his refusal unfolded with an unnatural clarity, as if the world had sharpened its edges in response to his decision. Every sound on the farm seemed louder, every movement more deliberate. He moved through his routines with the steady focus of someone who knew that hesitation no longer served him. The pipe remained exposed beneath the soil, a quiet arc of metal that had become the axis around which everything now turned. It no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like a responsibility. He chose his moment carefully. If the system had survived on invisibility, then exposure had to be precise, undeniable, and difficult to contain. He waited for conditions that would reveal the truth without ambiguity, timing his actions to coincide with peak demand downstream. The measurements he had taken over months told him when the flow would be strongest, when the evidence would be clearest. He prepared redundancies, ensuring that whatever happened next could not be undone by a single intervention. Copies of data were secured beyond his reach, entrusted to channels that did not rely on his continued cooperation. When he acted, it was not with force, but with demonstration. He documented the pipe's activity in real time, capturing the subtle indicators that transform suspicion into fact. The moisture gradient shifted exactly as predicted when he adjusted a small section of the surrounding soil, the response rippling outward through the field. Sensors recorded the movement beneath the ground, the controlled redirection of water that contradicted every official claim. The land itself became the witness, responding visibly to the truth it had been forced to carry in silence. The reaction was swift. Vehicles arrived at the perimeter of his property, officials stepping out with expressions carefully composed to suggest routine while betraying urgency. Papers were produced, authority asserted, warnings issued about interference and liability. He listened without interruption, aware that the balance had already shifted. The system could no longer pretend the pipe did not exist, not with evidence now circulating beyond its immediate reach. Attempts were made to reframe the narrative, to cast his actions as irresponsible, even dangerous. But the facts resisted distortion. The data spoke plainly, and it spoke to more than one audience. Pressure intensified, but it changed in character. What had once been quiet attrition became overt containment. Access to parts of his land was restricted under the guise of safety. Notices were issued declaring the area under review, as if review alone could erase what had been revealed. He was warned of consequences, of legal action, of the risks he was taking by challenging structures far larger than himself. The words no longer carried the same weight. He had crossed the point where fear could redirect him. As the situation escalated, the story began to move beyond the narrow confines of his farm. Questions were asked that could not be answered with procedural deflection. Why was water being diverted from agricultural land without record or consent? Who benefited from the continued operation of infrastructure officially deemed obsolete? How many other properties had been affected in the same quiet manner? The system responded as it always had, with delays and partial disclosures. But the context had changed. Silence no longer felt neutral. It felt suspicious. The personal cost became immediate and undeniable. Legal challenges threatened the land he still fought to protect. Financial strain deepened as resources were diverted toward defense rather than cultivation. The future of the farm remained uncertain, suspended between acknowledgement and retribution. He understood that victory, if it came, would not resemble restoration. The seasons already lost would not return. The soil would take years to recover, if it ever fully could. Yet beneath the uncertainty lay a steadier truth. He was no longer guessing at the cause of his ruin. He was confronting it openly. In quieter moments, he returned to the fields, not to measure or record, but to stand and observe. The ground still bore the scars of years of extraction, but subtle changes had begun to appear. Moisture lingered longer in certain areas, not enough to promise abundance, but enough to suggest possibility. The land responded not to hope, but to reality, to the gradual rebalancing that followed the interruption of an imposed order. It was a reminder that systems, no matter how entrenched, depended on continued compliance to function. The system's final attempt to reclaim control came in the form of a choice presented once more, stripped of pretense. The terms were harsher now, the consequences more explicit. Withdrawal of allegations, transfer of land rights, compensation reframed as resolution. It was the last offer of silence delivered with the certainty that refusal would invite prolonged struggle. He weighed it carefully, not because he doubted his path, but because he understood its implications fully. Acceptance would end the conflict swiftly, preserve fragments of stability, and close the chapter with minimal disruption. Refusal would extend the battle indefinitely, with outcomes impossible to predict. He declined without ceremony. The decision felt less like defiance and more like alignment, a return to a sense of self that had been eroded alongside his fields. The cost was real, and it would continue to be paid in ways both visible and subtle. But the burden of silence, once lifted, did not return. In its place was a clarity that no compensation could replace. As the weeks passed, the story settled into a broader reckoning. Investigations moved forward unevenly, impeded by resistance, yet propelled by scrutiny that could not be entirely suppressed. The pipe beneath his land became a symbol rather than a secret, evidence of how easily harm could be distributed when accountability dissolved into bureaucracy. His farm remained vulnerable, but it was no longer isolated. Others came forward with similar experiences, their losses reframed not as personal failure, but as systemic design. In the end, there was no neat resolution. The land did not suddenly flourish, nor did the system collapse under the weight of exposure. What changed was subtler and more enduring. A truth that had been buried was now part of the landscape, as real as the soil and as persistent as memory. The farmer continued his work, not as a man waiting for restoration, but as one who had reclaimed agency over his own story. The pipe remained beneath the ground, its presence acknowledged at last, its future contested. Whether it would be dismantled or repurposed lay beyond his control. What mattered was that it no longer operated in darkness. The choice he had made ensured that the cost of silence would never again be invisible. Beneath the ground, the system had depended on secrecy. Above it, a man had chosen to speak, and in doing so, had altered the balance in ways that could not be fully undone. If this story made you think, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Watch our next videos for more true stories hidden beneath the surface, and explore other videos on the channel you might have missed. Share this video with someone who loves real stories with depth and meaning, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.